class of our almost 4-year journey. Some would say eternity. In our looking at the history of our fellowship and the things that influence it and so on. And so we got a lot of ground to cover today, so we're going to try to cover it. And then, of course, next week, as some of you read in the blurb, Daniel Harp over yonder. That guy. Daniel is going to lead a section on about 3 weeks, right? 3 weeks, or as we do in this class, however long it takes, on worship. And so that should be good. And then that's going to be followed by Art Hernandez is going to be doing a course quite a bit longer than 3 weeks on kind of that intertestamental period and the first few centuries. And it should be fascinating. And the purpose of that is just to help us, again, understand how they understood things. Because this far removed, we might understand things way differently. And so just trying to give context and so on and so forth. So, okay, as we ended class last week, we've been looking at the different things that have been going on and revitalizing, recognizing not only this fragmentation that had taken place, but also that decline. And we've all been aware of that over the last 10, 20 years, especially, of decline across the board of people attending church and, somewhat, and again, it's very, very complex and all that. And so we've been looking at in our fellowship how people have been responding, and some have been responding to these things by advocating, let's look back. What were those foundational understandings of the first few centuries? Leonard Allen's book, In the Great Stream, was referring to those things. In other words, what are the things that are most important? Because as we've covered extensively and looked at in our history, we've often made all kinds of little things the most important things and have divided in different things over that. So Jack Reese I think he's retired, maybe professor emeritus or something at Abilene. And he wrote a book a few years ago. I remember Gary said, "Have you read?" And I said, "No," and I got it and read it. And wrote a book called At the Blue Hole, an elegy for the church on the edge, for a church on the edge. And the Blue Hole referred to a spring that was down there in Texas. Of course, everything comes from Texas, right? And this spring is what provided the water for became the rivers and all the different things that were down there. And so that's kind of the metaphor he's using. And he was looking for a more explicit retrieval of our Churches of Christ tradition. He predicted Churches of Christ would in fact die in one of two ways: death by following Christ or death by self-destruction. The sixth of 6 resources that Reese listed from our heritage summed up the grace tradition, and we talked extensively about that, in his hope for the future flourishing of our movement. We can be an apocalyptic people, a holy people, a Christian counterculture formed and nourished by God's Spirit, serving the world with grace and pointing the way to Jesus, living today and with God's end in mind. In other words, all these things that have so focused and so divided, he says, who should we be looking to? And so, in a sense, Christ, and that, we started as a unity movement, and that kind of got pushed aside over time, though lip service was given and so on. So these are the kind of things that they're talking about. Oh, I got to turn that on, don't I? There are many more proposals we could explore. There's a book out there by Flavel Yakeley, and he wrote this in 2012 called Why They Left. In other words, he talked to people that left Churches of Christ and were trying to understand what they had to say. And Benjamin Williams' significant compilation of 14 leaders' reasons for not leaving was a book, Why I Stayed. And so there's several. I have not read these. They've been on my list. I haven't got them yet. And so regardless, the point should be clear now that Churches of Christ in the 21st century faced a time of decline and kind of, as we said, the identity crisis. Who are we? Our fellowship is not alone in confronting the new cultural context that led to an increasing number of Americans not affiliating with religious institutions, as we've already said. However, some of that, they're saying, has been changing. That trend seems to be kind of reversing, maybe, sort of, and maybe it's been happening a few years. Remember, whenever they write these things and realize this, that's some data here. And then, so even as they're writing about this, which is true, some of those changes may already be happening. And so, anyhow, so what are we to do? Churches of Christ have come a long way since those sectarian days of the past and the rigid exclusivism forged in a division with the disciples back in the late 18th, early 19th century. If in the 20th century Churches of Christ completed the logical transition from sect to denomination, as we have greatly chronicled, the denomination fragmented in the late 20th century and early 21st century. Many leaders, even those who retained theological exclusivism, found themselves at home in the culture, from traditionalists who often allied with those who would be called the political right, to progressives who often allied somewhat more with those who might be considered political left. And as we talk extensively about this blend of religion and politics and things that have gone on, and so that's what that's referring to, and so these things have been what we're dealing with. To be sure, pockets of people sought to return to an apocalyptic identity. In other words, that separation from the world, have nothing to do with it. And we said there's people like Lee Camp and Mere Discipleship and others that in the last 20 years, 15, 20 years, have been writing about this. In other words, re-examining those things of people like Lipscomb and Warren Stone that we covered extensively, and saying, let's take a fresh look at this. Maybe that wasn't so crazy, because remember, those understandings got pushed out when we hit the 20th century, especially with the world wars and so on and so forth. Well, some have said, hey, maybe we should look at that. However, even most of those people engage in civil government and political realities. In other words, instead of going full Lipscomb, if you want, they kind of that blend, kind of that fusion, as so many things do in history, no matter what the topic. And in the end, people across the theological and political spectrums had their vision of Christianity and the good deeply shaped by their own time and place. And we've talked a lot about that, the lens through which we see things, our experiences, our upbringings. We heard, Joe Longer say, well, we didn't know anything about that in our little neck of the woods. Well, that's true. And so lots of variation. Can Churches of Christ be saved? Do we need saving? Should we die to make room for new life? Whatever one's answers to these questions, one historical reality is clear: the challenges and decline in identity amid this fragmentation that's been going on since the 60s presented us with some real difficult challenges. Now, there was a question that was asked early on in this class of almost 4 years, covering our fellowship's history, and that was, where are we going with this? Where are we going? Some of you maybe remember that question being asked. And that's a question that we, as a fellowship, we've often asked, because deep in our DNA of our fellowship, I think we were kind of suspicious of anything we felt might be questioning or trying to change any of the status quo. And that was because we told ourselves that everything we did was because we had a Bible for that. And any deviation from those positions was viewed as a departure from Scripture. And after all, have we not restored the New Testament church? And we said that Alexander Campbell and different folks way back then said, we've got it. We've read this. We've got it. We're doing things the way it should be. Bill. Oh, I'm sorry.
Actually, I just want to make a comment. There, pursuant to what you were saying, there is a rise of interest in David Lipscomb,
Yes.
and particularly his writings on the interactions, or shall we say non-interactions, of Christians and secular government.
Civil government, yeah.
It's coming. Our son Norman.
Yeah.
And Gary has also served as editor and some other things, has a contract with Vanderbilt University to republish
Yes.
the new version of David Lipscomb's On Civil Government.
Yes.
And it may be time for people to really be reading that again and challenging what happened in the 19-teens and 20s and the way that the church was manhandled by the government to get it involved in the war movement.
Sure.
So anyway, I just want to mention it.
No, good point. If you couldn't hear it, Christiana said that Norman, her son, has been heavily involved, along with others, in republishing Lipscomb's On Civil Government that had a lot of effect. It was a bunch of articles he wrote that were compiled, and it was a very significant book. And of course, what happened, as we said, that due to the world wars and the coercion of the government, in other words, generally Churches of Christ tended to be what they call pacifists, generally. And so the government said, you can't do that. And so there was a lot of pressure put on. So these changes and things happened from what historically had been positions. And so, and of course, just we said about Lee Camp and others, there's been this revival of at least looking at it. Now, how large it is, I'm not really sure, but at least it's a segment.
It's a balancing effort to try to balance the extreme militarism
Yes.
of our government, and our government telling Christians that they should be involved in killing other people.
Yeah. And so, sure, and it's a topic that will always have a lot of debate to it in our times. But anyhow, thank you for that. We told ourselves that there was only one way to serve the Lord and obey Him, and that was our way, because we were convinced ourselves that we studied our Bible more than anybody else. Because otherwise, if we could all study our Bible, then we would understand it the same way that we did. Because it was clear to me, it should be clear to you. And we all know what we're talking about. And then that would bring about unity. Unfortunately, that noble idea that was a foundational thing of our movement, that let's just come together in the Scriptures, didn't work. And the reason it didn't isn't because people's hearts are all bad or things like that, is that we're all different. We're all wired differently. We think differently. We have different experiences, different things, and that's always going to affect how we look at things. And so if one demands that it have to be whatever this is, then that's not going to do very well. And historically, as we've seen, that's been the case. Even within our own. It's easy to point out to everybody else, but then when you turn it in on yourself and all those things happen, you go, what's going on? Now, this attitude is not unique to our fellowship, but we had it in a very strong measure. And again, a lot of people did, certainly in the 19th century. Where are we going with this? My hope is that through the detailed presentation of our history, and some would say way too detailed, that we would see that there is much more to our history than often the summarized, and I would say sanitized versions we have been taught. My hope was that we would see that the reality is often messier and more complicated than we understood, and that those messy, complicated details are important if we're to seek and discern truth. The realization should drive us to be more charitable to other fellow seekers of truth who may not see things like we do. And you know, I'm not saying there's not truth, but often we've made all kinds of things supposedly what's supposed to be it, and there's reasonable things otherwise. Bill?
About 65 years I've been thinking about these things or experiencing them.
Uh-huh.
No, I'm not 65 years old, but that's...
Nobody thought that.
They are. Anyway, the word you used earlier, exclusivism, that was an early crunch and an early problem because that exclusivism turned into a situation where you felt this way, therefore it's the only right way, and therefore we're going to exclude ourselves from anybody else. We're going to separate ourselves from the rest of the world, like the Chinese building the wall. Whereas that's not what we were called to do. And so what we have fought with over the last 65 years, I can remember, fought is not the right word, but is trying to reach out, trying to draw in, but yet not trampling our own personal beliefs in what the Bible has told us. And that's been a battle, and that's what the battle's been all about as far as I'm concerned.
Sure. And we're going to talk more, just exactly what you're saying. So it is truth that we must seek, however uncomfortable we may find it. And it can be really uncomfortable. I remember sitting in Pittsburgh, and I was reading the book, and this was, and I was just crying, reading this. So some of our history, and again, it's what it is. Truth is truth. God deals in truth, and so we need to deal with truth because God deals with truth. He deals with those realities, though He is not bound by those realities. We must also deal with truth as we discern who we are in this time and place, and try to share with the hurting world around us, a world we know that needs Jesus. We can no longer complain and lament that the world is not what it once was, but we must deal with what we have now. Nor is it acceptable to double down and build a bunker defense to protect us until none of us are left. You know, I remember how many times I've heard, well, in the 50s we did it this way, and this isn't the 50s. And some would say that was a great time, and others, depending who you talk to, might say that was a terrible time. For various reasons, and so it's a real challenge. How do we do this? We must open up our hearts and our minds, I believe, and be willing to re-examine and test our understandings of many different topics with a fresh engagement with the Scriptures. Now, why would I say that? Well, I guess because that's been kind of my journey. I've known how I thought. I've participated in all these things that were, done that, been there, done that, thought that. And I also realized how I've changed on a lot of stuff because I've tried to re-engage and re-look. Now, for some, that's very scary because in our heritage, any kind of change is very scary because there's this, and any deviation from this is terrible. Well, I have found that when we do this, if we do this, that one of two things will happen. And I should be careful about saying one of two because they said there's always a spectrum. But we will either become stronger and more convinced of what we've understood, which is a good thing. That's a good thing. Or we may find ourselves asking questions and saying, you know what, does that make as much sense as I thought it once did? And again, this is not just randomly, just whatever, but rather with reasons, with evidence, with things to back it up and to look at things. Questions that may cause us to rethink our positions and realize that other understandings may have plausibility, validity, and substance to them. Told, did you knock me out? Oh, no. We were always told that, you can't do that. After all, what made sense at one time may not make sense now. And I think we can think in our life about all kinds of things and see that sometimes those things are true, let alone these topics. Jack Reese, in another of his books that Bernie gave me actually maybe it was last year, and I read it this year, called The Body Broken. Now, realize this book was written like 25 years ago, 20 or 25 years ago. In other words, realizing these things. And so he examines this fragmentation and division that's characterized our fellowship the last several decades, and I would assume other fellowships. He describes some of the thoughts and attitudes deeply embedded in our DNA that have caused many of our problems and must be dealt with. Two attitudes he talked about in particular that greatly resonated with me. The first was what he called the attitude of certainty. And this was an attitude is one of being so sure, so confident in one's positions that there can be no other possible conclusion. And this attitude bred an arrogance that dismissed any understandings and conclusions that were different from what I or we held on whatever topic. And of course, we've often talked about extreme things like, if you have a kitchen, what I'm saying, but that comes from this. And we've explored how there were those that would arrive at that understanding. Talked about a hermeneutic and so on and so forth. Because if nothing else, the purpose we've been trying to do is try to understand how these things became the norm, if you will. And we've talked about those that insist that unless you use one cup, our communion is invalid, and perhaps even our salvation. And so, and again, those are extreme examples, but nonetheless. Many of the positions and understandings that were proclaimed with great certainty eventually became orthodoxy. And especially crystallizing in that period from 1889 to 1929, as we've talked about, was a very significant time following the Civil War. And so there was more diversity within the Restoration movement, more so. And then it just came together and crystallized. And any differing conclusions were viewed as departing from the Word, putting one's salvation in jeopardy, and not just the conclusions, but also how we reach those conclusions, the hermeneutic. And I remember Betty saying several years ago, what's a hermeneutic? I never heard of that word. And of course, a hermeneutic is that system or way of interpreting, Scripture. And again, it can be all over the place, very complicated and dependent on whatever. And so we had ours that was deeply entrenched in the Enlightenment and that factual way of understanding things. Any interpretive approach that was not command, example, or necessary inference would bring about a false understanding and must be resisted. The labels placed on teachings that departed from approved orthodoxy included strange fire. How many things were labeled strange fire? Lots of things that maybe didn't have anything to do with, but it was different. False teaching and even heresy, because it was different than we understood it or how we came to those conclusions. Those labels were thrown around with great liberality. Articles and books were written and published. How many of us read those? Because remember, as a fellowship, those magazines and the different periodicals were how much was communicated within our fellowship. Because remember, we didn't have the hierarchy of control from above, yet we didn't really quite see how influential the writings were and the books were and those kind of things. So it was just kind of a little different form. And it was demanded that people choose sides often. Where are you on this? There was people like T.B. Larimore who refused to disfellowship those that use instruments, so he didn't like them. And there were people that got on him because he wasn't going to pick sides in that, even though he had a side, but he wasn't going to enforce those things. One of the guys in the past. Those who chose the wrong side were often marked, withdrawn from, and even disfellowshipped if they persisted in these directions. This confidence in one's ability to discern above all others had devastating consequences. By ignoring Jesus' command to love, forgive, be kind, and be full of grace to one another, the most unchristian behavior and attitudes were justified and tolerated because we were convinced it was in defense of the Bible and truth as we understood it. And there was a lot. I mean, if you can probably remember reading, I know the ones I've read, oh my gosh, the most terrible things were said about others because it was not the orthodoxy. And so, Well, and that's going out there. I'm talking about even within our own fellowship, the devouring.
During that 65 I mentioned before.
Yeah.
It's probably been occurring longer than 15, but it's standing in front of a gentleman at our church booth at the fair, and that minister in Christ told me that I was going to hell because I used one cup. Because I didn't use one cup. And I remember early on telling a Baptist member, having a church group just next to us, that he should check out his facts. He may be going to hell because he doesn't have the same attitude I have towards baptism. But all of that has changed for me.
Sure.
And around me and a lot of people that I've experienced, because now I'm a true believer that I'm not to judge that person. That I'm to depend on what you just had up on the previous screen. The love, the mercy, and grace of God. He is to be the judge. All I can do is make sure I don't sway from my own personal beliefs unless taught properly that that's the right way.
Sure. Christiana.
I was just going to say, my own mother told me I was going to hell because I would not renounce instrumental music. Even though I prefer a cappella, the fact that I would not say it was bad, she told me I was going to hell, my own mother. And it's that attitude.
Yeah. And again, every group has that. There's always those segments that are like that. It's like, wait a minute. Last week, Shane brought up this passage, and so I put it in here. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. Indeed, my plans are not like your plans, and my deeds are not like your deeds, says the Lord. For just as my sky is higher than the earth, so are my deeds superior to your deeds, and my plans superior to your plans. That passage alone, I would hope, would humble us a little bit on maybe some of that certainty. And again, I'm not, we're certain about Jesus Christ. But kitchen, one cup, what version of the Bible you read, what hymnal you use, how many songs you have or don't have in the service, what's said exactly at the communion service, or different things like that. Just a thought there. Just a thought. Another point Reese made was what he called the tyranny of the proximate. Tyranny is defined as cruel or oppressive government or rule. And proximate can mean very close or near. And of course, we're familiar with the word tyranny when we study the beginnings of our own country. That was used a lot about what England was doing to us. Reese points out that we can often not see larger realities in the world because our eyes are so focused on what is proximate to us. And that is what is both spatially and temporarily. In other words, we got all this, yet we're seeing like this. And we're not seeing all these other things. And so this is all that we know, and this is all that we assume. We tend to view everyone and everything through the immediacy of our own experiences. And that's what we talked about long ago about the lenses through which we look through and cover us. As a result, we sometimes find behaviors, customs, and points of view strange or even wrong. And those affected by the tyranny of the approximate are largely unaware of other views and cannot imagine other norms or possibilities. And viewed temporarily, that others might produce different behaviors or values. When we assume that what is normal for us is normal for everyone, we are tyrannized by the proximate. And you heard me share that we had a gentleman visit us a year or two ago, or whenever it was, and he was very upset that we were reciting the Lord's Prayer at the end of our worship service. He was very upset at that. And had reasons why he was very upset with that. And it's like, And so why was that? Well, I think this is some of that explanation. And maybe some of us can remember when we thought that way. I know when I did. And the challenge is there. So where do we go from here? I hope we will have open minds and hearts. Re-examine the Scriptures as we've applied them to many topics and positions that at times have created great angst in our fellowship. Not being afraid to ask real questions. Not being afraid to look at things afresh and anew. The purpose is not to demand that one change what they have believed, but rather we seek to understand differing positions instead of abruptly dismissing them because it's not what I've believed or been taught. I hope that we would peacefully and respectfully engage rather than blow up and leave. Because if I stayed, that would be saying I'm giving acceptance to something that one felt wrong. I would hope that we I hope that we would change our mind if we've been persuaded. Why should we do this? Because Jesus calls us to unity, and we've heard this often. I remember hearing videos and things where the brother up there is demanding that the world be unified because he commands that, and that's true. But what he really meant, meaning the brother saying this, was you need to agree with me on all these different topics. And because I'm right and you're not. And so unity, however, is not the same as uniformity. And that's what we often think. Unity is where I'm accepting those differences. And again, I'm not saying any and everything, that it's everything with that. You say Jesus is not the Son of God. Well, we got some work to do. But it's not uniformity. And often in our history, it's been uniformity that's been demanded. And that will never work, as our history shows. It has never worked. And to think that it would, by pressing down, demanding, and all this, that's not going to work. But we've got to be united. John 13, 34 and 35, I give you a new commandment, to love one another. Now, why did Jesus say that was a new commandment? I thought I read about love in the Old Testament also. It says a new commandment, just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. Everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Well, what does it show when we're writing up someone else because they thought, or they're saying this or that, have a different view, different opinion on things? Is that loving one another? No, the world sees that. And you know what? Just a minute, Bill. We've talked often. Why has there been these name changes that have gone on in these major churches and things like that? Why has there been? Why is Waypoint down there on 94? Hey, that's a Baptist church, and I don't know if their beliefs changed any, but why did they take Baptist out of it? Why have there been Churches of Christ that have not had Church of Christ in their name, or others? Well, it's because it was baggage. It had negative connotations, and so they're trying to remove that kind of a barrier because these things have happened there also. And so I'm just showing some evidence of this phenomena. We have seen the fruit of division that has been produced by the attitude of certainty and the tyranny of the proximate. Often we fail to see the irony of rampant division among our own people, even as we continue to admonish others for their division. Guilty, guilty, guilty. I am. Been there, done that. Understand that. Ashamed of it, but been there and done that. I heard Randy Lowry, Donnie and I, when we were down at the summer celebration at Lipscomb a number of years ago, and he said something that really resonated with me. And so what was happening is that down at Lipscomb, they were hosting the Dove Awards. What's that? In Christian music, that's like their Grammys. Okay? Lipscomb was hosting the Dove Awards. And so he said, I know many of you find this strange, that the Church of Christ guy is hosting the Dove Awards, meaning the non-instrumental people are hosting that. And of course, why are you doing that? And so he said, in the partnership with these things, he said, I can no longer count on my neighbors having the same worldview, Christian, as I do. Nor do I have the luxury to engage in doctrinal spats over every issue, no matter how small. And he could have prefaced, as I did in the 50s and 60s, okay, where everybody did that. And so if I don't engage with those who have the same worldview, then soon I will have no one to engage with. And he was saying that we must abandon our attitude of exclusiveness and work with those who are followers of Christ to carry on the mission. And I just found that just really hit me hard. I don't mean that I'm sitting there dying or something, but it was like I couldn't argue with that. Couldn't argue with that. And so very, very significant. Hebrews 12, 1 through 3, therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with the perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you may not grow weary and lose heart. Now, we go, well, yeah. We might say, well, yeah, let's follow Jesus. Isn't that what we've been doing? Have we? Just a question. I know personally, I used to be one that, I like reading I don't really like reading the Gospels. I like reading Paul's letters. Because you know what? That's practical. That tells me what I need to do. And so I can find out more what I need to do and all, and things like that as a young Christian. I had that. And I just thought, geez, it's kind of boring. That's not the how to do it. And then, obviously sometime after that, I learned, wait a minute. When I heard, I think Patrick Mead say, we need to learn to interpret Paul through Jesus rather than Jesus through Paul. Because what is the foundation? Jesus is the foundation. The Gospels are the foundation. Now, that doesn't mean ignoring the letters and things, but what did Jesus do? And that was really different. And you'd think, well, that shouldn't be different. Well, it was. It was very different. And it impacts you greatly. And then you start reading the Gospels and you start seeing, wait a minute, Jesus was eating with sinners. Of course, we all knew that, but all of a sudden it hits you a little different. Or Jesus forgave this person for doing that. Well, we would have kicked them out. We wouldn't want that influencing us negatively here. And I'm just saying things like that. It just kind of struck me, and still have not figured it all out by any means. Bill.
Is what I was wanting to mention. This goes back a few charts to unity. And then you just touched on it with what you just said. What would Jesus want? During the first 13 verses of chapter 4. Boy, now I'm confused. Anyway, I think that's it, 4:13 and 14. He spent a lot of time through his apostle describing the good and the bad of it, the do's and the don'ts.
Yeah.
And then in verse 14, he says, but above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfect unity.
Sure.
That's what Jesus says about unity and about how it relates to all the other things.
And so all of it goes back to that. And it's not how often have we've judged others' Christianity based on who they voted for or what political party they belong to. And it's not that one can't have strong feelings about policies on one side or things like others or stuff like that necessarily, but it's just like dismissing. It's like, wait a minute, that relationship isn't this, it's this. And I'm just speaking from personal experience, that's a way different way of looking at it. And I haven't processed all that yet. I still find myself screaming at the TV, at times when you're watching the evening news, right? What are they doing? But nonetheless, this is what we're to be. So let us look to Christ anew for our understanding of what it means to follow him. Let us transform our hearts and minds, or let us let him transform our hearts and minds through the Holy Spirit. Let us approach the Scriptures with an open and hungry heart as and not assume we got that settled. Because there's a lot of things, how many times have we, when we were younger, we knew everything. And as we got older, we realized how much we really don't know. At least that's my experience. May our love of God and each other encompass all that we do. And so what does O'Fallon do? Where do we go? We need to seek after Christ. We need to look diligently. We need to love one another. We need to forget. We need to be a place where people can come in and be loved. Now, that doesn't mean there's not sin. That doesn't mean there aren't things, it doesn't mean any of that. But it means that what are we going to be, because that's what Christ did for us. So that's all I got. So thank you very much.